happy to have Dr. Tami Biddle back with us today. I think it was, what, last spring you spoke with us, Tami?
I think that's right, Dave, yes.
Yeah, and Tami, you will recall, is the professor of military studies at the War College, the Root professor. And Tami, you've been there how long?
I've been there since 2001, so it's nearly 20 years, Dave.
Yeah, that's a
Wow.
good run, as
Yes,
they say.
yes.
And Tami is the better half of the Biddle team, and you all have, I'll say that today. Tami has, Steve has been with us, of course, many times as well. So without further ado, Tami, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, all right. So yes, I am what's known as the Elihu Root Professor of Military Studies. Elihu Root was our founder. He decided in 1903 that the Army really needed to up its game a bit. It needed to professionalize. And this was in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, when the Army had not done particularly well and all kinds of problems were revealed. We did win the war, but it was kind of ugly and bumpy. And it exposed a lot of problems. So he decided, he was then Secretary of War, he decided that he was going to do a number of reforms that would bring the Army into the new century and make it more able to compete with other armies in the world. This was a moment of expansion for the United States. It was a time when we were really beginning to develop economically. It's the late industrial age, and so the United States was just taking off, and Secretary Root decided we needed to have a better Army. So he founded the U.S. Army War College, which was located in Washington for a good long time, and then it moved out to Carlisle Barracks in the early 1950s. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is civil-military relations, which is a really important topic that we don't often hear very much about. And unfortunately, it's not taught really in civics classes. It's something that most Americans, I think, used to know because they had some contact with the military. But nowadays, because the military is all volunteer, we don't tend to have a lot of contact as a society or a community with our military services. And so people know a little bit less about the military than they did, say, 40 or 50 years ago, when many more people had contact of some form with the military. But civil-military relations are really a key pillar of our democratic society, or at least particularly in the form that they take in our society. They're very important. And we need to understand them and know about them and really take them to heart, wrestle with them a little bit, and try to make sense of them as a society. So I'm very grateful to you for taking the time today to participate and to learn a little bit about what we call civil-military relations. So when Elihu Root founded the college, he argued that it was not to promote war, but to preserve peace by intelligent and adequate preparation to repel aggression. And then obviously he wanted his students to study and confer on the great problems of national defense, military science, and responsible command. And that's still what we do today. When students come to the War College, they are coming usually around the 20-year mark. They've served in the military for about 20 years. They are largely lieutenant colonels, but there are also some full colonels. By the time they graduate, virtually all of them will be full colonels, and that's a pretty high rank in the U.S. Army. We have other students of equal rank from other services, the Navy and the Air Force, and we have this year 60-some international fellows from around the world. And we're very grateful to have those students with us because they allow us to understand the world through different eyes, through non-American eyes, which is terribly important for our students to see how our partners around the world understand problems and cope with problems. And it builds those relationships. So when our students depart from the War College after their 10-month program, they've formed bonds and strong personal relationships with the people that they have studied with over the course of the year. So a little bit about the college, and I won't spend much time here, but I know that many of you probably wonder what goes on over at Carlisle Barracks. And it's a campus. It's a small Army post. It's very compact, one of the smallest, probably the smallest in the country. But it's very prestigious because it's the home of the War College, and it's also the second oldest Army post in the country after West Point. And we have a variety of things going on. We have a Center for Strategic Leadership. We have the Focal Point, which is the School of Strategic Land Power, which is really the U.S. Army War College and its teaching function. And then we have the Army Heritage Center. I hope that you will come and visit AHEC if you haven't already. It's a fantastic facility. So if you want to know a little bit more about the Army and the military, it's a great place to visit and learn a little bit. They have some wonderful displays. It's a terrific museum. They have talks, lecture series now, of course, like everybody else on Zoom, but there's lots going on there. And we have a peacekeeping institute and a senior leader development program. So we have quite a few things happening at the War College at any given point. And all of it is quite important to the Army and to the nation. So currently we have about 450 students in our resident class. And then we have about the same number doing strictly online education, distance education. So that's kind of what we do. And as the year goes on, well, let me tell you just a little bit about this famous post of ours. These are all the things that Carlisle Barracks has been in the past. It's been a school since it was established. Well, it was first established as a post, just a military post, which was pretty far west in terms of 1757. This was kind of the Wild West. And then it became the artillery school in 1778. And then you can see all the other schools that have been located on the post. And then in 1951, the War College moved from Washington, D.C. out to this post. And a lot of us like it out here because it's not so hectic and crowded as Washington, and we don't have to fight traffic. So people find this a very convenient location, but it's also very easy for senior people to get here. They can hop in the car, and depending on the timing, if they get out of the traffic readily, they can be here in 2 hours. We have lots of Army officers, very senior folks, general officers who fly up in a helicopter. It's a short hop up from Washington, D.C. So it's a nice location for us. And this is a little bit about what goes on in our typical classrooms. You can see what our classrooms used to look like. We were squeezed together in rather tight rooms. I was just telling Dave that this year we have changed that. We've utilized all the large spaces on our campus to spread out so that we're at least 6 feet apart, and we teach. I wear a mask, so I constantly have fogged up glasses all the time. So I'm kind of teaching through the fog of war. And we are trying to hold in-person classes, and for the most part, it's working. We have a disciplined student body, well, fairly disciplined student body, who don't tend to party late at night, and so they have stayed fairly healthy. Sometimes we have students who have visitors, and so they have to quarantine, and they just go online for that part of their teaching. But for the most part, we've been able to teach in person, and we'll do that up through Thanksgiving. Then we'll go back online for part of the winter, and then we'll go back into our classrooms in January. So, but that's what a typical classroom looks like. And increasingly we have women faculty are still fairly rare. I was one of the first, and I'm the first to ever be allowed to run a major course for the entire War College. I am currently running what's called War Policy and National Security, which sets the curriculum for all 400 and some of our students. And on to the next slide. So what we do is a couple of things. We educate, we get our students ready for leadership at the very highest levels. And this means bringing them out into the political community. They've mostly worked inside the military institution up to this point. But now as they move into very senior positions, they are going to be interacting increasingly with the larger democratic society of which they are a part, which means that they really need to understand that interaction between civilians and civilian policymakers and their own military institution. And we call that civil-military relations. There are many, many facets to civil mil, but the one that we really focus on is getting our students ready to go back out and work in a very diverse, very complicated, and often very messy democratic society. So we work on that all year, and we help them learn how to articulate their views, how to speak to civilians, how to stay within the boundaries and the norms that have been set up in American society for their working in our policy community, and they're helping us as professionals to keep the peace around the world and to keep America safe and to protect American interests around the world. So that's one of the big themes of our year. There are lots of things going on. They learn all sorts of things about the history of warfare, the nature of war, the character of war, how wars start, how they end. They learn about regional studies. They learn about different parts of the world. They learn how to plan campaigns. Should the national command authorities decide that we need to go to war, they need obviously to be very adept at that. They learn about deterrence and coercion theory. So they have a lot on their plate. They're very busy people for the 10 months that we have them. This year, their world is a little bit different. They're not playing softball, for instance. They have mandatory softball usually. The Army is a very physical culture, so it takes sports seriously, but this year there is no softball, which the teachers are liking because that means students have more time to actually study, which is very important to us. So we're kind of pleased about that. And we'll have to see how things work out after this year. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about our Constitution. We have a Constitution that structures our government and it structures our society in the way that we operate. And the Constitutional Convention, which was established the specific checks on the military and ensured that control over it was divided. We had founders who were very wary of the military. They had watched the role of the military in Europe, and they had seen where sometimes military leaders had overstepped their bounds, had interfered in politics, or had become very powerful politically. And our founders really didn't want that. So when they were structuring our Constitution, this was after the Revolution, they've seen the Articles of Confederation and they didn't think they worked particularly well. So they were really trying to decide how to structure a government that was going to be effective, but that was not going to be oppressive. And how to have a military that would protect the nation but wouldn't become too powerful itself. So Article 1, Section 8 gives the Congress power to raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a navy, but it divides power. The executive branch has the power to, gives power of commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy to the president, who needs to be able to operate that Army and Navy in a nimble way and be very responsive. But the Congress has the purse strings and it has oversight powers. So the founders felt that this was a good way to keep the military in check and make sure that it did not become too politically powerful. And then we have, in addition to these specific laws, which are codified, we have things that are called norms of US civil military relations. And norms are very important. They are informal rules that, although not codified, are widely understood and respected. And as one set of scholars has recently written, norms do not simply rely on political leaders' good character, but rather are shared codes of conduct that become common knowledge within a particular community or society, accepted, respected, and enforced by its members. So the norms that we set up and structure around governance and around the behavior of our government are terribly important because they keep government from becoming oppressive or gaining overreach or concentrating power in the hands of a few. And obviously in a democracy, that is terribly important. And education on norms and understanding norms is crucially important, which is why I would love to see us bring back more vigorous forms of civics and civics education in our high schools. We've kind of drifted away from that, and it worries me a lot. Because I know of the many forms of governance around the world and realize that democracy is a rather precious thing, I really want us to teach our children how precious democracy is and why it's so important and how we can preserve it over time. So as Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt have recently written, like oxygen and clean water, a norm's importance is quickly revealed by its absence. So we have a lot of civil military norms that we developed around having basically a professional military in the United States. And the founders were, as I said, nervous about this. They were more comfortable with the idea of militias, groups of citizens who would come together and be armed for particular reasons if there was an uprising or a problem that needed to be solved with coercive violence. And then it would disband again and people would go back to their farms or to their jobs, but we would not have a powerful standing military. Now that changed over time, and as we became a major player in the international community, we needed to have a more robust military. And by certainly the late 1800s, after the Civil War, we were starting to develop a more robust Navy and Army both, as we rose in our status in the world and as we took on more important global roles. You may remember Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. That was really the beginning of major naval construction and activity for the United States Navy in the world. So a little bit more about why our founders were nervous about politics and military mixing and thinking that it was a potentially very volatile and unhappy mix. They were concerned, as I said. Now, obviously, they didn't know about, the founders didn't know about Napoleon or about Kaiser Wilhelm. They were in the future. But these symbols of people who became involved in politics are very powerful to us, and we see them as troubling and problematic. So the French Revolution started off as a revolution for democracy, but it turned into something rather different when Napoleon gathered a lot of power in his own hands. And so there he is later in his reign, because he really looks more like a king there than he looks like a democratic leader. I think you probably know that your democratic revolution is in trouble when the head of it is now wearing a crown and an ermine stole. Not a good sign. So that's what the founders were concerned about. And then we have to the right of Napoleon, we have Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of Germany at the outset of the First World War. And again, he actually had a parliament, but he didn't pay very much attention to it, and he tended to think that people in parliament were largely his servants. So again, that's what our founders were trying to avoid. I would say, you know, again, you should be a little bit nervous about the state of your democracy if the leader has a helmet with a large bird on top. These are sort of visual cues that things are maybe not going in such a democratic direction. So we were exceptionally lucky in having this piece of real estate that we happen to have with these wonderful moats to the east and west, the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, which protected us, and then relatively benign borders to the north and south. Of course, we did fight with Canada and Mexico at times, but for the most part, those borders were not troublesome to us and did not cause a lot of social and political havoc for us in this country. Countries like Germany, which are surrounded on all sides by potential enemies, can be subject to a lot of political military turmoil because the military is important to keep the national defense, but then political leaders become very powerful and get tempted to go into politics, and that's what our founders did not want. So we have a system that is civilian control of the military, and this is very important. The founders did not want the military to control our politics. So basically, the bottom line here is that if you have legitimately elected representatives of the people, and that's what we mean by representative democracy, government by and for the people, the primary authority is going to be in the hands of those who are elected, because those people are in fact true representatives, and if they do things that the people do not like, they can be voted out in the next election cycle. So they are actually quite responsive and responsible to the population. And that's terribly important. And one of the things that I would love for all of our school students and all Americans to realize is that our elections are amazing things. They are like little mini revolutions every 4 years or every 2 years, where you have controlled turmoil, where people get to decide if the folks in charge have done a good job or not, and whether they should change out based on the job they've done. In a lot of other countries, things don't get resolved politically that neatly and that what's the word I want? So, well, smoothly, I guess is the right term, but also acceptable in a way that is really meets with the approval of all the citizens. They believe in the legitimacy of elections, and they believe that the people who have been elected have legitimacy. And that's awfully important, because that allows people to believe that if they have views, that those views can be expressed. People do very poorly in political systems when they feel like they have no voice, or when they feel like their dissent cannot be expressed effectively. That leads to upheaval, it leads to insurgency, it leads to a lot of problems. But regular elections that are viewed as legitimate and are carried out in a fair way allow the political system to function smoothly and effectively for all the people. Now, obviously, the military does not stand for election. The military has a whole different system through which they gain their own legitimacy. They rise through the ranks, they enter in, especially the officer corps enters in after they've been educated, and then they move up through the ranks vertically, and they do not come in horizontally. They have to go through a system where it's very systematic, and they move up in the ranks. And they obviously never stand for election, which means that they should not be in charge of really key, important decisions about policy, because they are not representing the people. They have an important body of professional knowledge, but they are not representing the American people. So they are out of electoral politics, which means they should not have control over issues like when to enter a war, how to raise taxes, or to establish formal or informal relations with a foreign nation, healthcare policy, the whole gamut of things that you put on the political agenda. The military has a very particular, very focused slice of responsibility that should not enter the larger political realm. So we want to keep the military out of politics and nonpartisan. So keeping the military nonpartisan and viewed as separate from politics has been very important to our nation and to the political stability of our nation. We tend to take this stability for granted. We are so fortunate in this country to have a long-standing tradition of very stable civil-military relations that we don't ever even think about it. It's just part of the air we breathe. We don't worry about the military as a political threat. We don't worry about the military getting involved in politics. We watch recruiting videos for the military that show the most extraordinary advanced weapons, and we never think, oh my gosh, that's intimidating or that's frightening. They could use those against us. We never assume that because we have this very long-standing tradition of a separation between the military and our politics. And we're incredibly lucky in that. Not so many countries around the world have had that luxury. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that for a very long time, because we were in this wonderful space geopolitically and geographically, we had the luxury of allowing our norms to develop slowly and to really get traction and to become well established so that people knew them and respected them and believed in them. And we didn't have a lot of external interference and a lot of turmoil. So our norms and our government system was able to evolve in ways that is very rare around the world. And I point that out often to my students. My international students know that because they can live in very tough neighborhoods where politics are all around them, and there are competitive nations all around them and threats around them. And it's very hard to keep politics and military issues separate. So we're exceedingly fortunate for the situation that we have in this country and to have the stable relationship that we do. Now, a very important book about civil-military relations was written in the late 1950s by a professor who spent most of his career at Harvard. His name was Samuel Huntington. And he wrote a book called The Soldier and the State. And it opened an important dialogue on US civil-military relations in the aftermath of the Second World War. And that was a critical time because, of course, the United States had at that point really stepped up and become a major international player and had taken over the responsibility for maintaining the international system in many ways, had taken that role over from the British. And so now we were having to think about not only developing alliance structures and a larger bureaucracy for national security, but also a much more, a larger and more fully professionalized military organization. And Huntington was worried about how that military organization would fit itself into a liberal democratic state. And when I say liberal, I mean that with a little L, meaning basically a society that has lots of independent rights, individuals have individual rights, and the society is not overly burdened by governance constantly in the face of the American people. So how do you keep a military institution that's now going to have a lot of responsibility and authority from gaining more political power in the period after the Second World War? And so Huntington was wrestling with this problem, and it was a good time to wrestle with it because we had just seen some fairly serious disruption of civil military norms under MacArthur during the Korean War, when General MacArthur disagreed with President Truman and made that disagreement quite public, which was very disruptive and undermining of civil military norms. So, and MacArthur had obviously become a very powerful man in the course of the Second World War. And so his challenge to Truman was a serious challenge and a serious challenge to our civil military norms. So Huntington wrote his seminal book in this period, and he decided that the best way to So again, picture of Harry Truman and General MacArthur having had a major dispute during the Korean War. Huntington decided that what a system called objective control would be the best way to do this, whereby the military would have its own sphere of professional expertise, and that would stay quite separate from the political realm. The military would be nonpartisan, it would be as apolitical as possible, and they would offer their best professional military advice to senior civilian leaders when they were called on to do so, and otherwise they would stay separate from politics. So civilian leaders would maintain authority over political questions while giving military leaders scope to exercise their professional expertise. And elected leaders would choose when to go to war and would articulate the political aims of wars. And then the military would participate in creating the strategy for winning the war, and then would make the war plans and execute the war plans. So to the greatest extent possible, these two realms, the military and the political, would be separated. Now, the challenge is that in practice, that's fairly hard to do. Well, let me give you the alternative to it. The alternative to objective control is for the civilians to control the military by bringing them into politics. And by bringing them, for instance, a particular leader brings military officers who are supportive of that leader into his own realm. So he would have his own preferred military leaders. And that's called subjective control. And that's something that Huntington rejected strongly. He said that this is basically dangerous. It makes the military a politicized institution. And if it becomes a politicized institution, it will become much less professional and much less good at what it does. It'll spend so much time engaged in politics, and also the people will lose trust in it because they won't see the military as a nonpartisan institution that serves all the American people. And it's terribly important that we continue to perceive the military as an institution that, as a professional body, serves in the best interest of every American. So those are the problems with subjective control, and that is the model that Huntington very aggressively rejected. He did not want the military to be pulled into politics. So there are some challenges, as I mentioned, with objective control. It's a little hard to carry out in practice because wars are political activities. You fight a war for a political end. That's the reason to do it. You don't just enter into violence for the sake of violence. You are trying to achieve a better peace. You're trying to achieve a more stable situation in the international community or in a regional area. But what this means is that civilians and military leaders must stay in an ongoing dialogue when the use of force is being planned or implemented. They need to be able to work together for this use of violence for political ends to be successful, for it to result in a better outcome and a better political outcome. So we can't have our military be entirely apolitical because they get into the business of a political act when they're fighting a war, but we still try very hard to keep them as nonpartisan as possible. And the way we do that largely is through our norms and by making sure that our military officers understand their role, do not overstep their boundaries, and stay in their own lane and stay out of the political realm to the greatest degree that they possibly can. That means there are some special constraints on the military that we don't place on other actors in the realm of our social and political communities. There are lots of people who work in the governmental sphere, who offer professional advice of various kinds on a variety of different subjects that bear on governance and that are of interest to our politicians. But the military is special, and the way that it handles its professional role has to be viewed as special and very controlled and very much within constraints and boundaries. And this is entirely appropriate because the military owns weapons, owns the tools of violence, and therefore, if it decided to enter the political realm, could be an intimidating, coercive element of that political realm. And we absolutely do not want that to happen. So we educate our military from the time that they walk into a recruiting office or the time that they are commissioned as officers. They take an oath to the Constitution, not to any given president, but very specifically to the Constitution of the United States, which establishes their nonpartisan status. And we have them hold to specific rules. So they offer advice to civilian leaders in ways that are very bounded. And one of those ways is that it is not meant to be public. They offer advice in private ways that do not look like that, or do not allow it to look like the military itself is advocating for a particular preference. They do this in private. Public advocacy is not appropriate. We do not want military officers expressing their views in the Washington Post or the New York Times, because that means they're crossing over into the political realm. And that is entirely inappropriate for military professionals. Typically, if an official, a high-level official working for a given administration disagrees with the president or with another high-level official in such a way that that person feels that they cannot do their job effectively, that person can resign. And that does happen, and it does not disrupt government. However, in the military, resignation is very problematical because resignation can look coercive. It can be perceived as a challenge to civilian leadership. So it's very rare that military professionals will step away, although it's not unheard of. They do not resign per se. What they do is they retire. Resigning would mean they would lose their, essentially their status and their retirement pay. So what they will do is retire early if they have a profound disagreement. But they really, you will not see many military resignations because it's perceived typically as influence on the political system. And that's the way that we should perceive it. We do not and should not view military officials and military advisors, and what I mean here is military serving in the military. We should not view them as just an average, just another type of advisor. They have a very specific, very bounded role in our society, and we need to keep them in that role. So nonpartisanship is very important, and it's a challenge. One of the things that we teach our students at the War College is how challenging it is to stay out of politics when you're working at very senior levels. When you're down in doing the nug work in the Pentagon, and you're not involved in political issues so much, you're not at very high levels, it's easy to stay out of politics. But once you get to very senior levels, it becomes very hard to stay entirely out of politics. And so you have to really internalize these norms and figure out where the boundaries are and how to maintain those boundaries. So for instance, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I have two pictures here. We have Marty Dempsey, General Marty Dempsey down on the right, who served under President Obama. And then when General Dempsey retired, they serve a normal term, and they don't serve for overly long periods, and that's deliberate too. So when General Dempsey retired and we had General Dunford come in, one of the things that happens is that a president and his chairman of the Joint Chiefs become friends in the sense that they're together a lot. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is a direct military advisor to the president. He travels with the president when the president is traveling. And so these are two people who will tend to spend a lot of time together. And that means that the chairman has to be very careful and very professional about keeping an appropriate distance, personal distance from the president, because the president will try to bring that person kind of onto the team. And to make that individual sympathetic to the administration's goals. That's a pretty natural thing. Politicians on both the left and the right do that all the time. And it's one of the things that our students have got to be aware of, that politicians will try to bring you into their fold and will try to make you sort of subjective, to make you sympathetic to their goals. And that is a very dangerous thing that our folks have got to be careful of. They've got to keep that distance and keep those boundaries in appropriate ways. That doesn't mean that they can't interact in a friendly way with the president and with his senior advisors. Of course, they should be engaged and attentive, but they can't let those bonds become political or personal. So this man, George C. Marshall, who was basically the leader of the Army during the Second World War, set a very high standard for maintaining professional standards. He was very famous for not allowing himself to be politicized in any way. And in fact, Franklin Roosevelt, who loved to call everyone by their first name, he was a very gregarious man. He liked to be informal. George Marshall would not allow the president to call him George. To the president, he was always General Marshall, and that was appropriate. General Marshall did not vote in elections. General Marshall did not feel it was appropriate for him to express a political preference for a president. Our officers are allowed to vote. They have the freedom to express their political views, but it is often recommended that at the most senior levels, general officers do not vote, because it reminds them of their obligation to be nonpartisan and apolitical. And we also expect our retired generals to try to be as nonpartisan and as apolitical as possible. That doesn't mean that they don't sometimes fail in that, and you will sometimes see general officers doing things that are a little bit kind of on the border between stepping into a political realm. Sometimes they become commentators. News outlets like to have general officers as commentators on military affairs, because military affairs are very specialized bodies of knowledge. So when you have commentators, you typically want people who really know what they're talking about. But it's a little bit of a high wire act for a retired general officer to speak about political issues, because the American people don't always draw a distinction between active and retired generals. And so we recommend to our students that they are very careful, and they stay very careful about anything that could be construed as political activity, even after they have retired. So after the Vietnam War, you know that we let go of the draft, and we accepted what became known as an all-volunteer military. It's actually an all-recruited military, and there's a little bit of a difference. Our military does actively recruit from the American people. But while this eliminated the problem for the military of dealing with the draft, which is a tough thing to deal with because you've got to make it fair. You don't need everybody all the time. Then you have to decide who does serve in the military and who doesn't. You're working with a lot of people who don't particularly want to be in the military. So working with a draft is a very challenging thing for a military organization to do. And there are lots of militaries around the world who do it and who do it well. But when we moved to an all-volunteer system, the military was able to sidestep or free itself from the problems that come along with operating a draft, but not having a draft raises some other problems. So the military, as an all-volunteer force, can begin to take on its own identity and its own tenor and its own personality. And in particular, since the Reagan era, the military has leaned conservative. So for instance, the ratio of Republicans to Democrats in the US military is 2.6 to 1 overall, and 4.1 to 1 in the officer corps. And what that has meant for some presidents has been that they view, if they're Democrats, sometimes they view the military with a degree of wariness. They're not sure that the military is kind of really on board, not necessarily on board with them, but sympathetic, or is as loyal to a Democratic president as it would be to a Republican president. There's a little bit of nervousness there. And on the Republican side, there's been a tendency to sometimes view the military as a political constituency. So the fact that we don't have a full draft and a kind of full representation in the military that a draft would give us, the full diversity of the American political spectrum, it's caused a little bit of a problem in terms of civil-military relations, in the sense that presidents can look at the military with a degree of wariness, or can look at the military as a political constituency. And both of those are very bad for civil-military norms. We don't want the military to be in either of those positions. We want the military to be nonpartisan, to be viewed as obviously supportive of all the American people and representative of all the American people. So this has been a little bit of a problem, and sometimes we talk about this, or scholars talk about it, as a civil-military gap that has developed as a result of the all-volunteer force. Because only about 1% of the population serves in the military, it's not as representative of the full American population as it would be if we still had a draft. So that's something that we've had to contend with our civil-military norms. So I've just talked a little bit about that, and talked about how presidents and citizens and all of our leading civilians have got to work to uphold the norms, and our military has got to work to uphold the norms as well. This is a job that is up to all of us. It's not the responsibility of any given constituency here, any one group. It really has to be in the hands of every piece of the American community to uphold civil-military norms. So we need to be educated, as I said, at the War College, and at West Point, and at the Naval Academy, and at the Naval War College. We are working hard to ensure that our military students understand civil-military norms, accept them, embrace them, and uphold them as part of their professional responsibilities. But we as citizens of the United States have got to help the military uphold those norms. And particularly our presidents have got to work to help the military uphold those norms. So when our presidents do things that undermine norms, it can be very problematic for us. So as I said, it's inappropriate for a senior military leader ever to be perceived as endorsing or participating in overtly political acts by a given administration. And that is why this particular action, which occurred basically, I think it was early June of this year, was so troubling and caused a lot of upset amongst people who study civil-military relations and study civil-military norms. this is Secretary of Defense Esper and General Milley, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, walking across Lafayette Park with the president for what was basically a political photo opportunity. That was what the president was engaged in, but it's not clear that Secretary Esper and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Milley, really understood what they were getting themselves into when they went on this walk. But it provoked quite the uproar, an immediate uproar, because this looked very much like military endorsement of basically a political photo opportunity. And so General Milley in particular came under very intense scrutiny and very intense criticism by lots of people, not only the scholarly community, but by other military officers who asked, first of all, what the heck were you doing? And what did you know when you took that stroll? Did you understand what position you were being put in? And then the next thing was, why did you let yourself get into that position? And you now must reestablish the norm because people have lost trust that you are a nonpartisan, non-political actor. So the response came in the form of this letter, and the print is probably too small to read on the left-hand side, but I enlarged a bit of it. This was the letter that General Milley sent out to, as you can see from the top, all of the military services, and he made it clear that he was going to reestablish and uphold the civil military norms of nonpartisanship. So the last paragraph says, as members of the joint forces comprised of all races, colors, and creeds, you embody the ideas of our Constitution. That focus on the Constitution was very deliberate. This is saying, kind of in coded language, we serve the Constitution, not any given president who happens to be in place at any given moment. So then it says, please remind all of our troops and leaders that we will uphold the values of our nation and operate consistent with national laws and with our own high standards of conduct at all times. And those high standards of conduct refer very specifically to civil military norms and the norm of nonpartisanship. And then General Milley handwrote on the letter, we all committed our lives to the idea that is America. We will stay true to that oath and to the American people. So the reference to the oath is the oath that they took when they were commissioned, the oath to the Constitution and not to a particular president. So the awkward thing here was that the president had put the military in a very uncomfortable position and had put General Milley in a very uncomfortable and indeed embarrassing position. And he had to then come back and walk the dog back to get our civil military norms back on an even keel, to restore our faith in the faith of the American people that our military was not becoming a political institution. So this really, upholding norms is something that presidents have to take seriously and help the military. Each side has its role in this, and each side has to participate equally and do the right thing. Civil military trust is essential, but it's not self-sustaining. It can't be taken for granted. All of us, including civilians, have got to help the military stay apolitical, because if it becomes a political institution, what will happen is that it will lose the trust of the American people. It will be seen as a political body, and it will be subject to all of the problems that we're seeing across the board in our society right now, and we don't want that to happen to the military. Right now, the military is the most trusted institution or organization in American society. And a large part of that is because they are viewed as objective, as nonpartisan, as apolitical. If that changes, their status will change very quickly. And the military does not want to lose that status. It doesn't want to lose that trust or that faith that the American people have in it. But that means that all of us have to participate in upholding norms, in respecting civil military boundaries, and in urging our political leaders to respect civil military norms. So preserving those norms is up to all of us. Okay, so that is the end of my talk. And I was quite delighted to be with you this morning.
Let us pray. Gracious and mighty God, we give you thanks for this day, for scholars like Tami, who study such important issues and look to be of service to our nation and the world. In Christ's name we pray, amen.